Hi, welcome to the New Normal Show. My name is Kylima Norman, and today we have a guest for you. His name is Paul Thompson. He's a 15-year principal veteran from Urban Assembly, Music and Art, but Paul has an illustrious background. Not only did he he's the founding principal of UAMA, was the Urban Assembly School of Music and Art. He did that in 2005, but he was a Chancellor's Fellow and he participated in the New York City Department of Education's Advanced Leadership Institute. I consider him a resident historian. He is also a friend, but let me just go on about Paul so that you understand today's guest is a treat. Before coming a principal, Paul had a career as a musician and a composer, and he worked across various genres of music styles, including hip hop, but all the way to classics and some jazz as well. In 2008, he sat on the endowment fund of the Arts Review Committee for Learning in the Arts for Children and Youth in Music and Opera. He is also a member of the Bards College's Board of Governors since 2007, and he serves as the chair of Diversity Committee from 2007 to 2009. So why does this all make a difference in having Paul? Well, having someone who, like myself, is a principal to discuss today's topic, which is education and is it fit for Black and Hispanic students, given that it was not created for Black and Hispanic students, the education system that we have today in America. Paul, I invited because I know with his background, not only just in the music industry, which is corporate, right? And in his background in education, he's also a self-studied, self-educated man, as you would say, someone who has looked into the background and see how education is affecting Black and Hispanic students and how he can be a disruptor. So Paul, I met him back in, I will say, 2013, when I first became principal at the Academy of Urban Planning. And we were similar in our thoughts and views, in that although we are principals, or were principals at that time together, we wanted to be disruptors of the system, people who challenge the status quo given to us with the institutionalized racist practices handed down in policies for us to educate our children. Now, you may be saying to yourself, how is that possible? How can a principal who knows that the education system is flawed and broken and whatever word that you can say, meaning it doesn't work for Black and Hispanics, how can someone, in spite of that, still be able to change and disrupt the system? Well, it's knowing history. When you know how the system is built and why the system of education in America was built as such, you then can be able to set within the policies given to you, policies to set Black and Hispanic children free and free the communities that you're in and free their parents and free just people. And the freedom we're talking about is freedom to think outside of the box, freedom to see beyond the policies that set forth, freedom to see that you can be a disruptor. So there's two schools of thought. There are the thought that you can disrupt from within, such as myself, or there's thought that you can disrupt from without. And I don't believe one is better than the other. It's just, how do you choose your position as a Black person in this paradigm that we're in? How do you choose your position? I happen to be successful at disrupting from within. And I will go on record saying I train disruptors. I train children to think outside of the box. I train them to see beyond what is being presented to them for the Black and white that is actually there. Oh, we have Paul. Paul! How are you?
I'm good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Paul. Let me turn up my volume. I think I was low.
That's what's up.
Okay, because I was having like a whole soliloquy about being a disruptor, you know, and how you're a disruptor. I hope everybody can hear that part, but you know.
I've been known to disrupt things.
Yes, a disruptor. And I was also talking about how can you be a principal knowing the fallacy of the system that we deal with and still be a disruptor. And I said, well, I've been successful disrupting from within, but there's also the school of thought of disrupting from without. No one better than the other. the paradigm has to be taken down, though, either way that we look at things. But nevertheless, Paul Thompson, everyone.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm good this evening. Very warm, very warm.
It's hot, which reminds me, let me make sure
Oh, yeah,
the
get comfortable.
AC's off so that we can, because when that thing comes on, it's loud.
Oh, it's loud. I took off one of my air purifiers too, and my turtle tank. You know, when you're a mom, you have been subjected to other people's pets. So in my office space, I happen to have the turtles. Okay, well, let's get down to it, Paul.
Yes.
We're here to discuss the history of education and also the subcontext of how it's not fitting for Black and Hispanic children because it wasn't made for us.
That's right.
Okay, cool. So how do you want to approach this? What do you want to start with? I think you're going with Baldwin.
Well, so I've been involved in a lot of Baldwin lately. And Baldwin has been with me for many years. And I found my father's copy of The Fire the Next Time in our bookshelf. I don't know, when I was like 19, 18. I didn't even know he had it there. And so I've been reading that and him since then. And he's The Fire Next Time specifically is kind of a seminal text for the foundation of my school. Every student reads it multiple times in the 4 years that they're with us.
Okay.
And so Baldwin's just ever present. He's also been the centerpiece of an artistic piece that I've been working on for the last couple of years. It's sort of an artist collaboration where we create a space. It's sort of like the Church of James Baldwin, where we honor his words and his work through music. And yeah, it's an interesting piece. It's happened in theaters and different places. So Baldwin has been fundamental to me. And this year I decided for our graduation, since it was, bless you.
Thank you.
Since it was the first time we ever did virtual, first time we ever did a graduation like this, I thought, I thought, we're an art school. I'm an artist. Usually my speech at graduation is really about, it's always something about Baldwin. It's the last time I'll be able to really address our graduates as their principal. Yeah. So, it's always a theme. And this year I thought, you know what? I need to come with a little bit more. So I actually created a piece that is music that I composed in video, and I layered on top of all of it a speech that Baldwin did in 1963. I just want to stop
right here because, some of our viewers, I'm not as well versed, but I know who he is. Tell us who Mr. Baldwin is.
Right. Well, James Baldwin was probably one of the most prolific thinkers to come out of this American experiment. He was a writer, a thinker, an educator, a social force. He was a brother to many. He's famous for being an uncle. But for the book that he wrote, the letter that he wrote to his nephew, The Fire the Next Time, he's a playwright. He just is a very powerful force who wrote, I think, his books span from, like the 50s through the 80s. And just a really intense thinker whose ideas were way ahead of their time in some ways. He was a friend to Malcolm X, to Martin Luther King. He writes about meeting Elijah Muhammad. He just was in the mix with everybody. And so, there's speeches or there's conversations with him and Nikki Giovanni. He knew and was dealing with everybody and was not afraid to speak about race in ways that were 1,000% accurate and really bucked where America was at the time and what they were willing to hear. So his words, even though a lot of them come from, this one speech I'm referencing is in 1963. I was born in 1970. I'm using it today in 2020, and it's completely relevant because the American experiment, while in some ways it's moved structurally, it's set up the same way. So the critiques and the analysis that he had, they really stand true today. And nobody, I don't think, has really advanced a deeper analysis of this American experiment and how Black people have been involved in it. And yeah, he's a spiritual thinker. Yeah, he's far ahead of his time. He had very profound ideas about race, sexuality, gender. Like he was just not. If he was afraid, he didn't live his life that way.
That's right.
So
take it back, right? Okay.
That's how I would describe him. Just quickly. But I use the speech of it is to make a piece of art.
Wait a minute. Hold on, I'm having some connection.
And
there you go.
And I felt as though art. We having a technical difficulty?
It happened.
Am I back? I've been stuttering all day. I don't know what's been going on with my connection.
No worries. I think it caught up on my end, so you can keep going.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
The perils of technology. Yeah, see, it's telling me my internet connection is a little funky. Yeah, this is what the quarantine does to us. It's like Max Headroom. You got to be old to remember.
I remember when he stuttered. The guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just, Baldwin is alive in my life. And so when you asked me to have this conversation, I thought, Baldwin is a really good way to kick off understanding this like larger question that you're asking about. So like, what is the history of education and how are Black folks connected to it in this country? I just want to start off by saying, first of all, like, I'm not a historian.
I consider you one, but I understand your context.
I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
And I know enough to read.
That's right.
And I like to ask why. And so, all of those things combined, a proper history, I think, to me is a story. And I just like to ask why. I like to know why things are the way they are. So for me, the way I thought the best way to kick this off was really to just talk about in this speech that he makes in 1963 to a graduating class at Castlemount High School in Oakland, California, right? So he's talking to 17, 18-year-olds right around the time that he just wrote The Fire Next Time. And he breaks down the idea of what it means to be educated. And so if we're going to talk about education, I think it's important to talk about what it means to be educated. And it's something that as a principal, I have had to fight to regularly define for people. Not what it means to be educated, but that you should be asking yourself, everyone should be asking themselves constantly, what does it mean to be educated? And so Baldwin starts off just fundamentally with that as the task of the first task of his speech. Like, so first we're going to define what this thing is. And he goes on to explain, there's two aspects of education. One is of the self, right? How do I become an educated person? And he defines that as, how do I come to terms with who I am, right? In this existence, this unknowable essence, right? Regardless of what faith you subscribe to, the point is that you have faith that you subscribe to, because this for us is an unknowable condition,
Right.
And so you to be educated, you have to be coming to terms with who are you and what kind of life are you going to live in this construct, in this reality, on this plane, right? So that for him is a lifelong endeavor.
Okay.
Right. It's not like, okay, cool, I get a piece of paper, the man has told me now I'm educated and I understand how to interact with the universe, right? That's not how that works, right? So however you define what education means for you is a very personal thing. And I think the way Baldwin talks about it, it's also a very spiritual thing, because like, why do you take the first step? Like, why do you continue breathing? Like, living is a choice, and you should educate yourself as to what's your purpose here.
Right. So that's like why the reason.
And in order,
I was saying that's why we know one of the reasons why this system doesn't work for us is because as Black and Hispanics, that definition doesn't enter any of the textbooks, any of the work that we do around education. Nobody asks us to define who we are. We don't deal with the definition of self as it relates culturally to Black people.
Well, see, that's a good point, because then his second definition is to be educated within the society that you live.
That's right.
Right. So he immediately acknowledges there's a self, and then because we are social beings, there is a society, and that they are two things that are at odds with each other, while they also have to live with each other, right? Because we are social beings, right? Like, we're, generally speaking, like, we're not recluse.
No.
Like, we band together to get through this experience that is ultimately unknowable to us. And so there is this tension that he begins to tease out immediately that continues throughout the speech. That is, there is a you and how you define yourself and what your purpose is. And then there is the society you live in. And that will define you based off the people, the power that run that society.
That's right.
And if you happen to be Black, if you happen to be a female, and you happen to live in the 20th century, or, like, at any time within the last 500 years, since Europe has been the dominant culture, or 1,000 years since Europe has been the dominant culture, you are living in a society that is predominated by Eurocentric white ideas of self. Period. That is the fickle finger of fate. If we were born 5,000-6,000 years ago, we potentially would have been born right in the Nile Valley.
Correct.
We would have been born potentially, in ancient Chinese culture, right? But be clear, we would have been in a social construct that has rules, and those rules, they exist to perpetuate the society. Right. And depending on where you fit in and how you define yourself, you may be at complete odds with what the social order is. Right. But you can't live outside of the social order, right? So he articulates this dynamic, this dual dynamic, and it has to be together, but there's always a tension between the two. He also articulates something that's super important, which is kind of the next phase, I think, of this conversation, which is, the role of education in society is really to protect the construct of society.
That's right.
Right? So in order for society to move, you need enough free thinking that new ideas keep it growing. Right? So you need it to be dynamic. You need new ideas. You need it to grow. But you don't need the ideas to be so intense that you actually become dangerous to the fabric of the social construct. So think, but don't think so much that you can outthink the people who control the social construct that you live in.
That's right.
So they're the tensions. And so to go back to the first thing that you talked about, like how does education and the history of education in America affect Black folks? Well, it was never meant for us.
Right.
So you can't divorce the social and the history and the construct of the social from the individuals in it. And so Africans were brought here not to take part in the education process.
That's right.
We were brought here to be labor.
That's right. 1619.
Right. So there was no one bringing us over here thinking like, yo, the Enlightenment is popping off. Like, what do you think about Hobbes and Locke? That was not part of the deal. Part of the deal was get in the field. You are the brute labor that's going to make this experiment work.
That's right.
And so,
good point.
You. It's a really simple point. Yeah. This is built for Black people.
That's right.
And in 2020, we've had Obama. That may be difficult for people to understand, but all you need to see now is what this administration and what Trump's rhetoric has released. It's very fundamental to the fabric of this country that Black people were brought here for a purpose. And that purpose, it shifted. And we don't call it what we called it back then because we've gone through historical shifts.
Wait a minute,
that
Paul.
Have had economic implications. Like there's a very complicated. Am I jamming up again?
Yeah.
Better.
You're jamming up. Go back to when you were saying this administration's is perpetuating the thing that was defined from the very beginning, which is Black people are not factors in whatever equation that they have in terms of productivity, just labor.
Right. Well, I mean, look, so the Civil War ended in 1865, and presently speaking, we're having conversations about Confederate flags.
Right.
And the myth of these statues that the Daughters of the Confederacy put up, 20, 30, 40 years after the Civil War was over to concoct a new history around what the Confederacy was. Like the role of Black labor, African labor, it's ever present if you're willing to see it, even though it's not spoken about in overt terms. At least it hasn't been in our lifetime. Right. But Trump has really brought that all back to the surface. Mm-hmm. So, people like Sean King are exposing it every day. You're seeing a clip of, this is the overt expression of what our relationship is to this place, to the citizenry. Right, not necessarily everybody, but this is what a lot of people still hold in their heart as to what we should be doing here.
That's right.
And the thing that Sean King's and those things don't capture, I mean, those are very extreme, visually extreme examples. But when you go and you read and you ask questions why, and you begin to understand the institutionalized racism and how through housing policy, law policy, really the relationship of slavery has just sort of shifted so that Black folks, still continue to function in a large way in a subservient position. That feed the industry of the country. Like that's what we were brought here for originally. So this is where it gets not messy. I mean, but there's a lot of factors that are all intertwining. So, first off, what is our relationship to the education system? we're not supposed to have one.
Right.
Now, if you put that to the side for a second, let's just put the Black problem for America to the side for a second. And then you begin to ask questions of, what is the history of education for people, for Americans, right? Who think that America is for them. That's an interesting, that part of history then takes you back sort of, because you have to understand, like, so what are the origins of how Western Europeans understand themselves to be educated?
Correct.
Right? And it goes back to Baldwin's idea around society. Every society has some form of indoctrination, or and indoctrination sounds sinister, but like a cultural literacy, right? Every culture has a cultural literacy, right? The Egyptians had it, the Aztecs had it, Native Americans had it. Like, you go anywhere in the world and any culture has a cultural literacy and it's passed down. That's part of their education for what it means to be us in this group on this planet at this particular time. And so, in Europe, and I only talk about Europe because it is the thing that gives birth to the American construct. But for Europeans, all of this starts back with the Greeks. Now, if you are a real historian and Europe is not the center of your historical universe, you understand that there were civilizations that really the Greeks owe all of their knowledge to.
Yes.
That's for another podcast. But, for Western Europe, all of it really starts with the Greeks, and that gets, like, immediately you start with Plato's Republic. He begins to articulate an idea around, like, what it means to be classically educated, right? And then there's, like, historical factors. So you have the rise of Greece, you have the fall of Greece. Then you have the rise of Rome, that really just takes and adopts all of the Greek stuff that, be clear, is an adaptation of the Egyptian stuff.
Correct.
And then you get the development of Latin. You did and then after Rome falls, then you get sort of like the medieval period, but the Catholic Church remains, and all of the texts that the Romans got from the Greeks and that the Greeks got from the Egyptians, the Catholic Church gets stuck with, because they're the ones that have kind of an insular society that doesn't dissolve when the Roman Empire falls.
Right.
And so the clergy really, for all of the Middle Ages, are the only people who read.
Correct.
Because they're the only ones who got books.
So when they burned down Timbuktu, which was the library that housed all those foundational texts, they did it so that when they told this new story, the remnants would be the documents that they took and that they can rewrite, since they were the only educated or ones who could read and write. And so they got the opportunity to shift the narrative.
Well, right. That's not sinister per se, right? That's just, we taking this stuff and we're going to re-image it as us, because, like, everybody sees themselves, like, what you do in your family reunion is what you do at family reunions.
The only thing with the Europeans doing it is that it seems to be their underlying theme as they travel through civilizations. They, whereas when you look at African, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or ancient Chinese and the Mayan, we kind of like document, this is where we got this, and this is where things changed. And we keep replicas, oral history. We can tell you how grandmama's potato salad got improved when other people came into the culture. They seem to have an underlying theme where things get erased and then they erect what they're calling new.
Yeah, I mean, I've always hypothesized, since, I really dug deep into kind of like trying to ask why, like why does the European version of, cultural dominance looked the way that it does and treated the world the way that it did, when other folks in different historical times, it's like the Egyptians had, everyone's got a version of slavery, but you're still human, right? In all throughout African history, Africans would fight wars, there'd be slaves, but you'd still be part of the family. Like you could intermingle, like it was just a different vibe.
And you got to keep your own family. That was key. Like you still had your own family.
Yeah, so like there were different, but culturally, the Europeans were rocking with a different energy. And the only hypothesis that I could really come up with is that the nature of living in a cold climate where you had to specifically define mine.
Oh, so you think the need
that's mine, because I got to deal with 8 months of cold where there ain't gonna be no other. So if I don't have mine, then I and mine die. And so, you come knock on the door and it's in the middle of January and we have been able to figure out how to have as like my little clique, and you knock on the door and you want to come and take what I got because you don't have any, you do that for a couple of millennia and all of a sudden you have a different mental like construct happening for you when all of a sudden gunpowder lands on your doorstep, which the Chinese had, but the Chinese didn't feel a need to run around and like shoot metal balls at people with it from a far distance. They were like, yo, let's throw stuff into the sky and see what it looks like, right? The Europeans see that thing and they're like, oh, I got this idea of mine. This helps me protect that idea from here while you're over there, and I'll never have to touch you.
I never thought of it that way, where when one is faced with peril, most months out the year, it will change. Well, we see that now with the quarantine with something simple like toilet paper. This idea of like, I stay in my house and you stay over there. Even I have to admit, like friends were trying to come over and my husband was like, no, like we're not engaging. What do you mean, lady? All of that kumbaya thing you got going on, it stops here because it's about survival. So having to go forth with that for generations, I can see with a concept of like desecrate and establish, oneself. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's how
it's a thought, it's a theory.
That's how I've hypothesized it.
Okay.
Again, I'm not a historian. I'm not,
You're just having a conversation.
That's what made me feel good and make sense about some history.
I never feel good about it.
We're all people. Like the difference between us genetically is like nothing. And so as different people landed in different places around the world, and you think about the traditions of like hunter-gatherer, like what it's like in a place where there's sun and stuff is growing all the time. Your idea about mine is like, oh, this is mine for now, but guess what? There's another one, and then there's another one, and then there's another one, and then right, like there's always going to be another one, so I don't have to be on it like this is mine forever.
Right. Unfortunately, that's what leads us down a path because it's not ours. Because it ended up.
And yeah, I mean, I was talking to someone recently. Like, there's the writings that Columbus did in his journals. And, when he landed on the islands and he's talking with the natives and they're communicating and they're like, oh, y'all look real different than the other people who've been here. And he's like, what are you talking about? And they're like, oh, there's some other people who've been here. They've been here a while ago and they've been traveling around and we trade and they're cool. And they're dark.
Yeah.
They don't look like y'all. Hair is different, look different. And so it's clear that when the Europeans left, they walked around with a very different vibe. But it's not, I'm not here to like say that everyone's had a funky vibe at some point. Like, we're human. It's just that this is the time period we happen to be living in. So we're experiencing it, and it dominates our experience, our existence. But if you go back to the idea of the education, so once you get, through the Greek period, then you get into this idea around enlightenment. right? They pick up on the stuff that Plato was doing. They kind of they begin to access the stuff that the church has had all this time, and they begin thinking about it now. But the people who are thinking about it, because they're not schools yet,
No.
right? So school didn't exist as a concept, right? Like you were born, you prayed, you lived. and guess what? The moment you could start working, you worked to live.
Right.
And if you happened to be lucky enough to, have the priests take you so that you could be trained to be a priest, right? All those priests, when they weren't praying and reading, be clear, they were dealing with cattle, they were dealing with farming. I mean, that's why priests and monasteries have a tradition of making wine, like making wool, because they were working farms. They just had books.
Right.
And so the Enlightenment comes along, and they take all of these ideas, but it's in the educated class are folks either with money or people who lucked into and had a predisposition to be scholarly. But it wasn't normal that people read. That just wasn't normal. That doesn't really come, I mean, it kind of happens at the same time historically. It's the printing of, it's the Protestant Reformation. So Martin Luther, he knocks on the church, he hangs his treaty, right? And he's like, nah, they running game on you in these churches, taking your money, trying to get these tidings. Y'all need to learn how to read the Bible yourself.
Right.
And so the Bible is really the first book that gets like mass produced and publicly read and taught and studied. And the people in the Enlightenment were reading other things, but like for the average person, that's super important. This idea of I at least have to read the Bible. And the way in which, then it goes back into just historically, like how the Protestants moved. You get the Anglican Church, and then as folks start to come, the Catholics came during colonialism, and then the English came, that they're using that as the justification for their business practices and enslaving these peoples to make these industries work. And so, if you take all of that kind of quick understanding, boom, now you land in Massachusetts, right, during the colonial period. And that's where you get, again, the average person during colonial period, like a kid, like this idea that we have about what it means to be a kid is a new construct, right? Yeah. So this idea that you get to be a kid until you're 18 is insane. Nice. Historically, even in the Western world, like that's a very new concept. It's like barely 100 years old. If you showed up on the shores of America, it's because whatever was happening wherever you were at wasn't popping for you.
That's right.
So you come in here and you got work to do. You've got forests to chop down, right? Like everything, like you got houses to build, you got clothes to make, you got to deal with winter because winter is happening here in the Northeast, Spanish went to Florida. That was like a much, but then you got to deal with that too. You got alligators, you got, disease, you got all, right, swamps, right? So they come here and they're just like, wow, this is horrible. They bring slaves. The slaves help make all of this far easier for them. Slaves aren't included in any of this education plan, but for them, they begin to kind of eke out an understanding of school. And in Massachusetts, they begin to think, and it's the first place where, compulsory schooling actually starts. And that's in 1852,
And what's compulsory school again?
where the state says you have to go to school.
Okay, so let me just give our audience a recap. What you're saying is based on the history that was going on in Europe at the time, we hit a period where enlightenment happens, and that enlightenment is brought across by the white Europeans to the New World as a way of informing the education process. But the Africans.
Well, I mean, not necessarily, right? So the ideas around enlightenment, those were for the haves.
Okay.
Right? So landowners, right? So the idea about education, like the only reading is the Bible.
Okay. All right. So basically, let me rewind. So enlightenment is for the haves, but for the white Europeans that came, the Bible reading is like the thing that they cherish in terms of being educated in.
Well, being educated in, I mean, like the reason why you're literate, like one of the main reasons why poor people of middle means, right? Like not the landed gentry, like one of the reasons why you would read is to access the Bible.
Okay.
And that, so because when you're talking about education, like this idea that we have of it didn't exist.
Gotcha.
Right? So you had the landed folks who had an opportunity to educate themselves on the ideas of the Enlightenment and like what it meant coming out of the Middle Ages to like build a society, right? And then those are the people who are controlling the society. Then there's everybody else.
That's right.
And everybody else is not talking about enlightenment. Everybody else they're reading the Bible.
Got you. And so basically the education process, from what I'm hearing, but I didn't get you to explicitly say, but I think you'll agree to, is that I would be educated in the things my family can do. Like if we were farmers and cattle, I would be educated in cattling. I would be educated in rearing crops. If I was a shoemaker, I would be educated as a shoeman. I would be educated as a cobbler, I mean.
You're a cobbler. Right. You're a blacksmith, you're a blacksmith.
Kind of like with Jesus. Jesus is a carpenter because Joseph was a carpenter. Kind of like whatever it is my family did, that was my education. I followed in their footsteps.
And that was the normal way in which early Americans were educated if you were not of the landed class. Gotcha. Right? So you had to work, you worked, and you learned. And if you had a family that could build a business and was mildly successful, then that's the thing that you taught your kids to do, unless your kid was like industrious and studious and was able to figure out something else. There was the opportunity for mobility, right? And so, there are some of our founding fathers who, they were maybe middle class, they didn't go to school, let's say, but people like Ben Franklin and George Washington. I mean, I want to say George Washington was trained as a surveyor, right? Like to measure plot of land. And so, and you could make a living at that. Not everybody was a lawyer.
That's right.
Right. Or was someone who read contracts. And so those people needed to be able to not only read, they were also like thinking of other ideas because they had access to these things that were coming out of the Enlightenment. I mean, it's not as linear as I'm kind of.
No. It's a lot of mitigating factors, and
there's a lot of stuff going on all at the same time.
But the clear part I want to bring out. The clear part I want to bring out is that the Africans that they brought over, our descendants, were not even part of this equation.
No, not at all. They were not. And unless they worked for a family who thought, teaching them to read made sense. But why do they need to be literate? That has nothing to do with the thing we brought them here to do.
Brute labor. I like that term. Brute laborers. That's what they brought us for.
Oh yeah, no. And that was the science experiment. I mean, they bred us for that, and they bred us like cattle. Like they and people need to understand that stark reality, we like to sanitize everything so much in our day and time, and we have this false sense of violence because we watch it in movies and in popular culture, but to really explain the ways in which they bred us like cattle, that's just stomach turning. But that's what the reality was. It wasn't about like, can we teach them to read? No. It was about furthering an investment. And people should understand at the end of the Civil War, slaves as a commodity was the largest commodity America had. So like not ships, not lumber, not crops, not railroad. The largest commodity that existed were ex-slaves. Wow. And so the whole country's economy ran off of slavery. Everything ran off slavery. That you can't divorce anything from it. So like these people are like, well, my family didn't own slaves. Everything about this country was built around slavery. So if you live here, the streets that are paved that you walk on, that your family only came here 20 years ago to walk on, right. They're there most likely because slaves cleared the land, and the economy that existed to build that road is based off slave labor. And so, yeah, part of the education, there's no including them in the education conversation. And really, poor whites weren't, the crazy thing about the American experiment, though, is that there was a high rate of literacy. So if I pulled some numbers from some of the readings that I was doing. Literacy rates during the colonial period were pretty high. It's pretty intense. I wrote these notes down somewhere. And, like the average person could read. And like I said, one of the reasons why, people were encouraged to read was because they read the Bible. And they would not have read the Bible if the Protestant Reformation hadn't happened. Gotcha. And so like, that's where kind of all of these things are connected. But, in 1850 or 1852, Massachusetts decides, we're going to develop compulsory education, right? The state says you have to go, right? And that's just before the Civil War. And so there is a movement that's happening. And again, you can't take all of these events by themselves, right? So the Civil War is happening because there's a fight between the North and the South around manufacturing and an agricultural economy, right? And then there's a government that's set up that's kind of been fighting back and forth around like who's going to be the prominent economy, and the Industrial Revolution really kind of throws a bomb into all of it, mechanical. And it's not dependent on slave labor, even though the materials that are going into the factories are dependent on slave labor.
That's the Industrial Revolution. And the words were a little mumbled. I'm having some connection issues, but the Industrial Revolution came after the Civil War.
Well, it's all kind of like happening at around, like all of this stuff is happening at the same time, right? So there's the discovery of coal, and that coal will fuel these machines. These machines will do things at a rate that far outpace anything that has ever happened within, European history. And so there are all these conflicting kind of forces going along. And like by 1952, you've got this period in terms of education where all of the states between 1852 and 1918, all of the states between that period adopt some form of compulsory education. And so the last state of the original Union to adopt compulsory education was Mississippi in 1918. So like that's after World War I.
Wow.
And so when you take this into like, this is the birth of what we might start to define as what we understand as school today. And you have to understand, like, the people who were primarily responsible for it, right? So we have our great universities already, right? So like, you know, we have the Harvards, like all the Ivies, you know, William and Mary, like you've got these places, but they're for the landed class. They're not for like the normal people. And so you've got these think tanks that are basically fueling the class of people in our society who are running things, whether it's business, banks, resources, right? Like it's pretty simple, right? So you've got railroads, you've got shipping, you've got coal, you eventually get oil, and then, you know, you get the education institutions that are educating the people who are then running these industries. And then you get the federal government and then the state governments that are helping to organize these industries to do their work. And so, you know, at the dawn of the 20th century, you've really got this American engine that's about to explode onto the world. And it's in that context that you get a group of thinkers. And, you know, there are all of these educational sort of philosophical folk that are always talking about, you know, education and like what are the best ways to educate. And again, you got to go back to Baldwin, this idea around like, what is it for the society? What is the purpose of education? Right? Every society is going to define what the purpose of an education is for the society's benefit. And so, you know, what happens with compulsory schooling is that the industrialists begin to understand we've got businesses that, because we have engines, literally like coal-fired engines, gas-fired engines, now we have these machines that will do things at larger quantities than have ever happened before. And all of these machines are going to be built in factories, and these factories are then going to cause a whole other level of industry. But we need to put a lot of people in these factories because it takes a lot of manual labor to make all this stuff happen. And so you get a group of people who kind of come together, and the money behind them are people like Carnegie, Mellon, Rockefeller, Ford, and they get together with college presidents from Harvard, Stanford, University of Chicago, and they begin to develop this idea about sort of what education is going to do, and that there's going to be a class of people that we continue to educate who run everything. And they're going to be the ones who get like what they define, you know, in the Republic as like a liberal arts, like a classic education.
Right.
And then you need just a group of people who are going to function.
Laborers.
But they got to be literate enough
to do basic labor.
Right. So that's the construct right, but we don't want to teach them stuff where they're like going to question their labor.
Thinking.
Right. We don't need you to be creative, right? We just need you to understand you can strive for a better life, a home, you know, a clean home, which, you know, was not necessarily a normal thing. 3 square a day, you know, some idea of stability for a family unit, but the family unit is tied to working for the corporation. And whether you're in a factory, dealing with steel, dealing with, you know, the mining of coal and oil, like building all the stuff that fueled us as a country through the 20th century took a lot of manpower. And it was this group of people who designed compulsory schooling, to basically do that. And so like, that's what the world was that got created for white Americans, and the all of the Europeans who came in droves through Ellis Island. This was the promise they were coming for, right? That I could work and I could set up some stability for my family, and it worked for them.
Right.
Like, the experiment worked. They built it and it worked. And where were Blacks in that?
Nothing.
I mean, like, we weren't included in that.
No.
And there was policies, even though slavery may have ended, now you have Jim Crow. So they basically created another industry of incarcerating us, and enslaving us through that mechanism. And then, just, right, cheap labor. And if there were some who came through, like a Du Bois, or, there were people who came through, but it was rare, right? It was just like, there weren't a lot. You could count, the class of Black folk who were able to move through the American system. Well,
they were tracking us. So they let, the very first, one.
It's a complicated, like, it's an effective and efficient system, but it's big. So some people made it. That's how you get the inkwell, right? Like, there's a class of Black folk who made it, and during the summers they would go hang out in Martha's Vineyard, right? So it's not like it didn't exist. It did exist, but the society wasn't constructed to necessarily include them in that way. So when they did break through, there was always a tension. It wasn't right. Like, it never really worked. Du Bois famously, he goes to Harvard, graduates, he goes off to Europe. Racism is different in Europe. So, he was treated as just like a normal thinker, and they were like, wow, homeboy's brilliant. He's great. And, this is the period where they're wearing the top hats and they got the canes, and he gets off the ship in America, and they're like, forget you, Negro.
Right.
We don't write smart. And he's insulted.
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? I'm brilliant. And they're like, yeah, nah.
You're Black.
Who cares? You're Black. Shut up. And so, like, these tensions existed, and so, to fast forward, like, this has been created in this way, and I would recommend that people read, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and that they also get a hold of Richard Reuterstein's The Color of Law, because it breaks down housing policy. And so, as schools become what we know they are today, they're directly tied to housing policy and how housing was legally segregated.
Right.
And so, that's why I've opened a school in 2005 in New York City, right? Modern school. I was able to move in. It was new construction, new building, great. Everything's fantastic. Guess what? Pretty much 100% segregated. I didn't put up a sign that said only Black students. Like, the system has been built to have a segregated system, basically based on housing policy.
Right.
And housing policy was a national federal policy of redlining and designating who could get federal loans or federal back loans and who couldn't. So you can't have a conversation about education and where Black people fit in it, and why we continue to struggle in the ways that we do without talking about housing policy. I mean, there's a lot of other things that make it even more complicated, but there's a direct correlation between housing policy and schools. because we define schools by districts, and districts are defined by where people live.
Hmm.
And so, there's a lot I could go into that kind of highlights that. But, you know, it's the thing that I've also been focusing on a lot is so like once you understand the historical construct of like, okay, so now here I am, 2020, I've got a school of primarily Black and brown kids who, my first grade is ninth grade. That's a kid comes to me in ninth grade and they're not literate.
That's right.
And so this system is built to do exactly what it does.
Right.
So like I get a kid in ninth grade, then they're not literate. And I raise my hand and I say, wait a minute, I'm the last stop in this compulsory school process. And you're sending me kids who look like me that can't read, or who can, I always say this, like they can decode.
They don't know what's going on.
They can decode the post,
Hmm.
but they can't comprehend the times.
That's right.
And so I'm like, right, I'm very clear. I could break down, some numbers around literacy and where literacy rates in this country started to go crazy. One of the things in getting ready for this conversation that I really bugged out on is just going back to literacy rates. And there's a data point that's remarkable. Remember I said during colonial period, America was different as an experiment because the average person who came over here and who lived here could read. And so, it was one of the things that helped fuel the revolution, because there was a population that could be organized without having to speak direct words, right? You could get them pamphlets, like that's one of the powers of being able to read, is how you can disseminate information.
Which is why they didn't let the Africans read.
Right, because we don't want y'all talking about anything or reading about like how this stuff is working. But in World War II, right, for the biggest years that we were drafting soldiers, right, so 1942 to 1944, the literacy rates of all the people that they looked at, 18 million people got tested for the draft during those years. 96% literacy rate of the 18 million people that they looked at for a draft, right? So that's a lot. That's like 17 plus million people.
Well, I always said I grew up, in the 80s and 90s. All my friends could read. We all could read and we all could comprehend. I entered the education system in 2001. That changes.
Well, if you look at the trend, it's funny because 10 years earlier in 1932, for an all-volunteer force, literacy rates were 98%. So somewhere in those 10 years, the literacy rate dropped 2%. And no one really thought that was crazy, but having it drop 2% when you're dealing with that many numbers, that's substantial. Like, what's going on here?
Right.
And if you think about it, if you're testing people between 1942 and 1944, then they're being educated in the 30s.
Correct.
In the 30s, phonics was a fundamental part of how you taught people how to read.
Yep, right? Too.
Cut to 1951. We are drafting soldiers for the Korean War. They have to take a literacy test. Why? Because you need to be able to read the word explosive. Right? If I'm going to give you something and it's your meal, you need to be able to read it. Or, like simple instructions, like stop. You need to be able to understand that. And so Korea, 81% literacy rate. So in 10 years, it went from 96 to 81%. Now, those people were educated in the 40s. Now, what happened? the prominence of Teachers College idea around balanced literacy, right, and whole literacy began to take root as an industry, because they realized, again, the industry of textbooks was
Right.
born. And so if we can build a whole new industry and continue to build it, off of this idea of this is a new way to teach reading, then there's a lot of people getting rich off this idea, because these districts are now buying these books. The problem is that people aren't actually learning to read in the ways that we were. And so by the time you get to 1973, where like that's the ending of the Vietnam draft, right? So these are people who were educated in the 60s. Only 27% of the people tested were literate enough to be drafted. And so in the span of, what you were talking about, 40, 50, 60, 70, within the span of 40 years, the literacy rates of the men that we drafted went from 96% to 27%. And so you have to begin to ask, like, what is the function of your education system if your outcomes drop, not like dramatically, that's off a cliff.
Yeah, steep.
That's not a functioning school system to me. So, the literacy rates, they haven't gone that much farther up. And even though they changed whole literacy to balanced literacy, I don't care what you call it. I'm here to tell you that in 2005, when I start my school and ninth graders show up, they can't read the Times. Be clear, given our country's history, they can't even read and analyze the Bible.
No.
Not that that's what we teach in, but you know what I'm saying? Like historically, that was the starting point.
That's right.
You got to be able to read the Bible.
And like I said, I believe systematically it was done in certain neighborhoods, because phonics were taught in certain places. Not everybody went with the textbook way of teaching in certain neighborhoods, but they did in others. And I had the privilege of being in both neighborhoods growing up, where you were taught one way here, and then I showed up in my all predominantly white school, and they were like, you don't do that here. Here, we have basic phonics, basic sentence structures, and basic grammar taught. And then this is the basic way you write, and everything was systematic. That, be creative, and that didn't exist in the lower grades. As you got older, you got that. And I always said, as years went on and I got into the system, I said, oh, so people know the formula. They just don't want to teach it in every place, because they have to have this working class. They have to have the laborers.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, and it's funny, I was talking to my wife about this, everybody's got this idea of like Machiavelli and Illuminati, and it's like there's somebody holding a button, saying who gets in and who doesn't get in. Now, when Rockefeller and Carnegie and Mellon and all of these people were functioning, you have to remember, and it's hard for us to think about things in this way, but the same way it's impossible, it is very difficult for us to fully understand what slavery felt like and meant, right? Like I can't imagine what that I can't imagine walking out of my house right now and being treated like a slave.
Correct.
All of a sudden my life is gone. Like the movie 12 Years a Slave, where he walks out of his house, he gets tricked, and all of a sudden he's in New Orleans and he's a slave. Like I can't even, the way he bugged out, I can't even imagine how that would bug me out, right? So, and thank God that I'm that fortunate. But we also can't imagine a period where like eugenics was a real science that was studied, right? Where there was an idea about like crazy social engineering ideas were respected schools of thought. So like this idea that we use today in popular culture, like around Illuminati, and there's somebody like so that they can have, and then they can't have. You know, back then, when you got these guys sitting around the table talking about like, right, so who's going to work in our factories? They were that explicit back then about that because that was just normal. You know, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, they're all sitting there like, yes, we made more than everyone and we are better. We're genetically better. And so we're going to concoct this system. Having seen how decisions are made in you know, at Tweed or, you know, within government, you know, I don't actually think there's like Illuminati with the button saying like, well, this is going to happen to them and this is not going to happen to them. I think what exists is there are industrial forces at play. Mm. And those forces exist within a historical, cultural context, right? So and no one's taught to think about that, then that's just normal.
So I guess the question becomes, how do you become a disruptor? Because, I mean, certain things, even if, you know, we don't believe in the conspiracy part, right? There are certain truths that they found. Like, they did finance their war in Vietnam with the heroin they dropped in Brownsville, you know? Like, they did do certain systematic things in Black areas to ensure that, you know, the status quo would remain. So the question becomes, how do we become a disruptor in such a way that because this is societal norm, this is not a societal norm and you get the new normal? How do we do that? And then we got to close, Paul. But what would your take be?
Yeah, I mean, I think like for me, the thing that we've focused on at my school and that I believe in for me, it has worked for me. It's what I try to do with my kids in my house is it goes back to Baldwin's original idea of what it means to be educated as an individual. And so for me, it becomes very difficult for you to be an educated individual if you're not literate. Because we don't live in a society where you will be mentored by an all-knowing person, right, who will help you navigate and learn the observable phenomena that happens in front of you, right? Right. So, you know, you interact with a thing, you only understand your observable phenomena with that thing, right? You don't know the history behind it. You don't know the mechanics of it. You just understand how you are observing it at that moment. And if you don't have an expert in your ear who's explaining to you, but this is how that works behind the scenes, it could take you forever to build the knowledge to understand the inner workings of the thing you're observing. Literacy enables you to be your own mentor. So I wake up in the morning, I can have a conversation with Baldwin. Why? Because reading is an exercise of allowing myself to be on the same plane with the ideas that Baldwin is putting into the universe. And I can be one with them. I can integrate them. I can challenge them. I can build on them based on the things I'm observing, right? I can read anything from anyone in history. Like, it doesn't have to be related to just my time, right? I can connect with any thinker as long as I'm literate and I continue to always ask and humble myself to just asking why.
Right. So
to me, the ultimate disruption is just to educate yourself is to become literate.
Good. And I want to emphasize this part. You're not just talking about reading words, as you say, decoding. We're talking about critically thinking, questioning text, connecting it to your life, connecting it to other reading, Also to be numerically literate, because we as a society, Black and Hispanics, they shy away from numbers. You have to know how to read those as well. The patterns that exist, not only in literature, but the patterns that exist also in numbers. And how do you create thought around that?
Right. I mean, again, it goes back to the idea of why, becoming a problem solver. I mean, it's, which is why, like, I fight to have my instruction be about actual problem solving, right? I don't ever enter a conversation about tests or regents, right? Like, I don't want to know anything about that at first. Like, that's a problem that I have to manage as a bureaucratic manager.
That's right.
Right? Because if you're doing the work of creative problem solving around real world issues, you probably have the literacy, which is a very low bar, to pass these dumb standardized tests that are an industry of themselves. Like, people making money off of this industry of testing you. Yeah. And like, what's the best kind of industry? If you keep failing the test, you keep got to taking it, that's best for me. I don't need you to pass it. If everybody passed at once, that kills my profits.
That's right.
This idea of just asking why, questioning the things that you do.
Yes.
Why do you do them? That's right. Baldwin has this turn of phrase that I find incredible, where he regularly says, like, I don't mean to be rude, but, and then he'll ask a question that is totally personal, because the conversations that we have with each other should be personal.
Yeah.
Like, why do you do this? Why do you wear that? Like, what are the constructs of beauty that you have adopted? What are the constructs of masculinity that you've adopted? What are the constructs of femininity that you've adopted? Like, why is it that you do these things? What do you think the logical byproduct of those are?
Yeah.
But it lives in why. Just ask why.
Well, Paul, it was amazing talking to you. Do you have any words that you want to leave us with? Anything, words of wisdom before we sign off?
I done ran my mouth enough, dude.
It was good though. It was good.
I mean, just God, if you got, just go read The Fire next time. Go start somewhere, just and don't be afraid to ask why. You might discover something about yourself that'll make this life more interesting for you.
I take it. Know your why. Know your why. Thank you, Paul, for coming, Mr. Paul Thompson, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope this was fun.
This was great. I enjoyed it. I always love history. It's a good thing.
Good.
I love talking to good people. So thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
I'm going to go eat dinner now.
Oh, yes. Why?
Because I'm hungry.
Yeah.
All right, I'll talk to you later. Peace.
Peace. So everyone, there you have it. Be literate. And the literacy that we are talking about is not one where you pick up a book and just, intake knowledge to regurgitate. It's not for the memorization of fact. It's the literacy that we mean where you can have a conversation about ideas or themes, conflict that's happening in the reading with yourself, that the author is having with him or herself. Also how it relates, those words on the paper relate to other readings that you've read. And so as a parent, as an educator, my job and our job is to continue to build a literate class of individuals, because Black and Hispanic children were not a part of the authorship of education, but it doesn't mean we do not have the tools to crumple the system or implode the system, however you want to go about it. But it will be through literacy, because as you take in ideas of old, of various genres, you're able to create new thought. And that's why reading for slaves was outlawed and banned. They were scared that you would get a new thought. See, in everything that you read, an idea is birth. And so it's important that you read. So if I could leave with any solution for today's problem as to how to educate the Black and Hispanic child, I would say have them read to you every day, 30 minutes. Whether they're a young scholar or a much older scholar, or you're a grown scholar like myself, you're still a child when it comes to literacy. And so you need to read every day and have thoughtful conversations with others, but if not with anyone else, just with yourself. So writing down those ideas go hand in hand. Reading, writing, and thinking. That's how we conquer this problem, or begin to conquer this problem. That's my time. My name is Kylema Norman, and this is The New Normal. Stay tuned for a spinoff of The New Normal called Kylema's Corner, where I talk for about 15 minutes about a topic of interest. I will have Kylema's Corner aired next week, Friday, 9 o'clock, and I'm going to pay homage to my parents who birthed me. I believe in all things and all periods of greatness, one needs to acknowledge the life source that has been given to them through their parents. And so in Kylema's Corner, for the first episode, you're going to hear me pay homage to my mother and father and things that I learned being a child of Elaine Dixon and William Thomas Murray. But the new normal and will happen in 2 more weeks from today. And I will be airing, I haven't decided a topic yet. So in the comment section, if you have a topic of interest that you would like for me to find a guest for, please do that. And that could be my time for the new normal, or text me if you like. But you can contact me at Kylema, Kylee, M as in mom, A, period, Norman, at gmail.com. Again, that's Kylee, M as in mother, A, period, Norman, at gmail.com. Like this, this show, and please subscribe to The New Normal. We need the likes and we need the subscriptions. Thank you so much. And be literate. Read every day. Have a good one and be safe.